Hey, good afternoon, Judy. I just wanted to, first of all, say thank you for agreeing to participate in our 14 question series here today. It is an absolute honor to be speaking with you this afternoon. Have had a chance to read your book, Being Human, an unrepentant memoir of a disability rights activist, which is fantastic. Highly recommend this for anyone that hasn't read it yet. Please do. And also having the opportunity to watch Crip Camp on Netflix, which was also fantastic, and learn more about your story. Very excited to speak with you today, and thank you very much for being here.
Thank you for asking me to be on today.
Absolutely. Well, if we could, I've got quite a few questions for you here today, so I'm going to start from the beginning. Your parents exposed you to activism at an early age, fighting especially hard for your right to an education. What influence did their advocacy have on your work as an activist and your many professional accomplishments that followed after that?
So I think my parents really were the strongest role models that I had, certainly at that age, and really also as I was getting older. We're Jewish, and my family, my mother came over when she was 12 and my father when he was 14. And they lost their parents in concentration camps and other relatives. They met in 1945 in Philadelphia, got married in 1946, and I was born in 1947. And I lived in Philly for 3 months, and then they moved to Brooklyn. My parents learned to become advocates. That certainly wasn't something that they were really prior to my having polio, which was when I was 18 months old. And even at that point, when I just had polio, they took responsibility for making sure that I had whatever I needed. And when I was 5 and my mother went to enroll me in the neighborhood school, that's when I think my parents really began to understand that discrimination was pretty prevalent, although they were obviously at that point, 1953 or 54, really looking at me. They didn't know other families that had disabled kids. Wow. And so they finally were able to get me into a program, but it was only for disabled kids. And the teaching instruction was not very good. Not so much because of the teachers, but really more because of the system itself and how it was set up. And then over the years, my parents really had to do more and more advocacy for various things. Like my mother learned when I was in these segregated health conservation 21 classes, that at that point, if one used a wheelchair and couldn't walk up and down stairs, you would go back onto home instruction. And so she organized with some other mothers to get the Board of Education to make a certain number of high schools accessible, so that all of us who were wheelchair users, who were, I guess, deemed high school material, because there was a lot of discrimination going on. Kids with cerebral palsy, in particular, were staying in these health conservation 21 classes till they were 21, and then they were being sent to sheltered workshops. So when I first started going to high school, I was the first in the special ed classes in PS 219 of kids that went to high school. After that, a number of other children with cerebral palsy and muscular dystrophy and other disabilities did finally start going to high school.
Wow, that's incredible. It's amazing that your parents were able to fight those battles and that you were part of that movement. You were starred in the recently released and highly acclaimed Netflix documentary Crip Camp, A Disability Revolution, which begins by highlighting your time at Camp Judys, summer camp for teens living with disabilities. I love this part of the film. What impact did your experience at camp have on your confidence and in your path to leadership in the disability community?
I went to another camp prior to Camp Judys called Camp Oakhurst. And at that time in the United States, camps were, pretty prominent. And my brothers went to a camp, but I couldn't go to the same camp because they didn't have a disability that I couldn't walk and use my wheelchair. When I was about 12, I started going to Camp Judys. And all these experiences were really important. And I would say significantly because it was really the first time that we, as disabled teenagers, were really able to spend time together, not only having fun, which you do at camp, but also really exploring our lives. You know, we were teenagers, and so, you know, dressing sexually and trying to be attractive to people that we were interested in. Those are things that happened a lot more easily than they did in our communities because communities weren't accessible. And so camp really was an opportunity to not only get to know each other better and, you know, begin to do some dating, but it also was an opportunity to start thinking about futures. Like other kids were beginning to do. You know, people started talking about kinds of jobs they may want, education. And also we were really thinking about the issue of lack of accessibility in our communities and also lack of role models. We really didn't know other disabled people that were in a broad array of jobs, maybe accountants and social workers and speech therapists, but that was, you know, kind of it. And I think really being able to begin to see that there were things that could happen, and that was partly based on television. Television was very important at that time. I mean, it still is, streaming, whatever it's called, but because it allowed us to see what was going on in the South as far as the civil rights movement was concerned.
Okay.
It allowed us to really hear the word discrimination because people were not defining the barriers that we were facing as a result of discrimination. I couldn't get into school because I had a disability. No one was really calling it discrimination. It kind of, I remember it didn't really have a name, and when it was given a name, it was more likely to be they didn't know, they didn't understand, kind of, you know, empathetic towards the people that were discriminating. So we were really beginning to look at what was going on with the movement, look at what Black people in the South were doing, that they were speaking up, speaking out. They had clear demands, legislation they wanted, and they were also working not just within the Black community, but they were working with other minority groups and other leaders from different communities. So that was all very important. So I would say that, you know, camp time at Jeanette was really fun, exploratory, and a real opportunity to more seriously begin to think about future. And the fact that we did have a future and that we were going to have to really fight for our future because it wasn't going to happen by itself.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So I have a spinal cord injury. I was injured about 17 years ago. So I'll just say, before I ask this next question, I'm going to admit to you that I was crying seriously proud tears watching the second half of Crip Camp. I'm so incredibly thankful and proud of what you all accomplished. But that portion of the film, the second half, covers your activism and all that you all did to make the intentions of Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act a reality. So would you please, for those that don't know, would you please give our audience a summary of what Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act entailed, what happened, and why was this so important?
So Section 504 is a provision of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 as amended. That's its formal title. Says that any entity receiving money from the federal government may not discriminate against one based on disability. That was a very, very important provision. It was kind of a sleeper in the legislation. The disability community had not been very involved in getting this legislation to be a part of the Rehab Act. It was a small group of staffers on the Senate and House side, and I think a small group of people who were working at that time for some organizations like the ARC. But the disability community itself, with few exceptions, didn't really have many organizations run by disabled people. Now, it didn't define what discrimination was. It didn't define what disability was. You know, who were people with disabilities. It didn't define what a remedy was. So, you know, on the face of it, it could have meant that any public school, for example, all of which are built with federal money, they would have to be made accessible overnight. But of course, that was never going to happen. So when President Ford was leaving office, he could have signed the 504 regulations because it had gone through the process, but he chose not to, saying that it would be harmful to the country. Carter had said that he would sign the regulation, or he would have them signed, not signed by the president, signed by the head of the agency that had responsibility for implementation. So Ford refuses to sign. Carter says he will have it signed. The Secretary for Health, Education, and Welfare, who was nominated by Carter and approved by the Senate, name was Joseph Califano. And what happened was, when Califano came into office in January of 1977, he began to do a review of the 504 proposed regulations, which in and of itself was not bad because it was a new administration and reviewing it made sense. But what we were hearing from the very beginning is that Joe Califano had been a lobbyist for a number of organizations, and he was getting pushback from universities, healthcare facilities about what the regulations were going to require. Now, as I said, they were not going to require that everything had to become accessible overnight. They were requiring that reasonable accommodations had to happen, had to look at alternative ways of ensuring that people could get the same service, as well as also, you know, speaking about new construction and major renovations and what discrimination was. And, you know, you couldn't, for example, deny someone like yourself admission to medical school because you used a wheelchair. That would be discrimination. If you didn't meet the test, if you couldn't do essential parts of the job. But, you know, things like what is an essential part of a job? So, you know, like in many things, there are many different parts of a job, but something may be a small part of the job and not an essential part of the job. And you can switch it around so you do something more, somebody else does the part of the job that you can't do. But all those types of things that I think we now take much more for granted, that was the first time that they ever appeared in a regulation. So in the Bay Area, we had a committee. Our committee actually went to the regional office in San Francisco before the day of the demonstration and asked for the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare to set up a committee so that we could come. We had a permit to have the demonstrations outside of the building, and we also had permission to come into the building to have a meeting with the regional director. The rally outside was very successful. I believe it had a couple of hundred people at it, and from all crosswalks of life. And then after the rally was finished, we went upstairs to have a meeting with the regional director, whose name was Joe Maldonado. And to our shock, honestly, you can see that in the film when myself and Kitty Cohn and others were trying to engage in discussion. I really had presumed that because it was a public date that we were going to have the rallies, it was known in Washington. We had this committee to meet with people in the San Francisco office that we fully expected that at the very least, the regional director would know what 504 was, but he didn't. You know, as I said in the movie, he didn't, his staff didn't. And I think, you know, a couple of us had been looking at the prospect that we might want to stay in the building overnight. But had he come out and said, he understood them, if we were able to have a good conversation, if he said, you know, I'm on top of it, I understand what you want. Who knows whether there would have been overnight. But that is not what happened.
Mm.
We didn't know what the 504 regulations were. None of his staff knew what they were. They had no idea why we were there. He had not been briefed. And
Wow.
so we, you know, later on, because I was an assistant secretary in education, I really, you know, I would never go into a meeting like that, as unprepared as he was. But it was, on the other hand, really easy for us then to say to people, look, they're treating us like children.
Mm-hmm.
They're not taking why we're here seriously.
Right.
And we also knew if we left, it would be very difficult to come back. So a number of us like seized on the opportunity and asked, as you could see in the film and in the book, asked people to please stay. And so I think that was a really important turning point when disabled people, many in the group who had never been active around disability rights, really began to see that we potentially had the opportunity to really get a very important piece of legislation, to get those regulations signed. And that our goal was to get them signed as they were in January when President Carter came into office. So we were there in the building for 28 days. We had rallies outside of the building every day from labor unions, religious community, friends, allies. A little into the demonstrations, a group of us left and went to Washington. 22 of us left and went to Washington, D.C. We had support from donors to bring us to D.C. The Machinist Union rented a big van with big moving ramps, and they picked us up at the airport. We went straight to Secretary Califano's house.
Amazing.
We had demonstrations outside. I would say that we were always respectful. So, you know, we had a sunrise service. We had a Episcopalian minister with us, and we were not raucous. We had flyers. We gave flyers out as the sun was coming up, and kids were beginning to go to school. We were giving the flyers to the kids and explaining to the kids that that nice man, Joe Califano, who lived in the house right over here, needed to sign something that would allow disabled kids to go to school. And we tried to do everything at a language level that people could understand. So, for example, when we were in San Francisco with the demonstrations, we really tried to talk about not only was Section 504 important for those of us with disabilities, but it was important for the community. It was important for the community because one never knows if you're going to acquire a disability.
Right.
And, you know, like you acquired it. How old were you?
I was 22 almost 23 when I acquired my disability. Yeah.
Okay, so, you know, you never thought about any of this, I presume.
Not a single thought before. Never.
Yeah, if you had a thought, it wasn't positive, right? And so we really wanted people to begin to see that this was not just for us. Now, did everybody see that? Of course not. But we were laying the language to say disability is a natural part of life. You may have a long-term permanent disability or a short-term disability or both in the course of your lives. But
Right.
We're not only fighting for ourselves, we're fighting for you. And so ultimately, we were successful. This group, and I think it really was a changing time for the disability community in the United States and around the world in many ways, because we were able to demonstrate that we could work collaboratively across the country, blind people, deaf people, spinal cord injured people, intellectual disabilities, epilepsy, diabetes, whatever it might be, and we could be on the same page. And that page being an end to discrimination. Remedies may be different for one versus another, but at the end of the day, our mutual goal was a law that would protect the rights of all disabled people in programs receiving money from the federal government. And that's very important because we didn't have equivalent legislation to the Civil Rights Act of 64 until 1990, when the ADA came about. But I think many people do believe that if we didn't have 504, if we hadn't been able to work out all those significant questions, as I was discussing earlier, it would have been much more difficult to get the ADA passed. It wasn't easy to get it passed, but a lot of what happened was the result of work that had been done by the ACCD.
Absolutely. And you hit on quite a few of the questions I was going to ask you here in a second. So I would just like to ask you a couple more things about the 504 and then move on a little bit to some more contemporary issues. Actually, all those issues are still contemporary issues to this day. But I can't imagine personally. I don't like being in a hotel room for more than 3 or 4 days. How did you all pull that off? It seems as if you're saying, you mentioned earlier that you all planned for this in advance. Sounds like
only a couple of us.
Only a couple of you. Okay.
Yeah, it was like 2 or 3 of us had kind of said to each other, well, maybe we should think about staying overnight. So, for example, I brought an extra pair of underpants and a toothbrush and toothpaste and a few others. But really, it was kind of on the spot that we asked people to stay. And there's a guy in the film, Ron Washington, a black guy in a wheelchair. And he makes this comment, Judy, I'm not prepared to stay, but, we all made it work. Not everybody could stay who was part of the rally outside. People could come back and rally again, or, from their offices or homes, call people. And, but a good number of us stayed. And we actually quietly got a few more people in the building. So we had about 150 people in the building.
Incredible.
They went into the HEW building and refused to leave. But then HEW in DC refused to allow any food in or any medicine in. And so they basically left within a day. We use that in the Bay Area as a reason to stay. We said, not allowing medicine in for people who were in the demonstration was an indication of how the administration was not willing to listen to what people were asking for. And that's one of the real reasons why we stayed. We used the DC situation as a reason to say, we can stay, we're well organized. We had food coming in, the Black Panthers was giving food. I believe we also had food from Safeway, and we had a medical team that was there in case nothing major, but minor things were going on. We had a communications team. We had a recreation team. We had all kinds of things that would keep people busy, but that was also valuable work. So we were reviewing, for example, all of the media coverage. We did a press conference within the building because we didn't like the way some of the media were covering the story and the way they were talking about disability. So we did a press briefing on that. And we had a reporter from local ABC, Evan White, who's also in the film, who basically went with us to Washington, D.C. And Evan was giving regular coverage while we were in San Francisco, but then he was also doing coverage flying to D.C. and for the days that we were in D.C. So it was a pretty remarkable experience. Mayor Moscone understood and really supported what we were doing.
It's fantastic. And also, one of the things that really stuck out to me is that there were you all reached out to all kinds of different groups, and all kinds of different groups reached out to you. So other communities that have been marginalized, or groups that have been marginalized in society, all became part of this fight. And that to me was incredibly interesting. Is that something that just happened organically, or is that something that you all really made an effort to do?
I would say no, it didn't happen organically.
Right.
It happened because the committee that we set up in the Bay Area that started working in February, March, really was outreaching to organizations, all kinds of organizations, as well as disability rights organizations, and getting people actively involved, helping them understand what was going to be happening, short of the sleep in, which we didn't know was going to happen.
Right.
And it went relatively smoothly because people who were involved in setting up the rally and the meeting for inside the building were well-organized people. And I think that was very important, that there were people who had experience. We'd been working hard in our community. CIL had working with like free clinics and other organizations that were supporting other minority groups and groups for the elderly or aging. And we basically called in the chits because we would support work that they were doing.
Right.
And it was, I think people were getting the importance of this.
Well, that's actually leads right into my next question. Did you understand the significance of what you were doing and what was happening during that process and immediately after that?
I think the answer is yes and yes, but going into that, we understood what we were trying to do.
Right.
But whether or not we were going to be successful,
right,
that was a whole different question. But I think, in the beginning while we were there, the FBI had come and told us there was a bomb threat. But we had demonstrations in 1972 in Nixon headquarters in New York, and they had called in a bomb threat. And we, for half a second, took it seriously. But then we noticed that nobody from the Nixon staff was leaving.
Right.
So we said to each other, this is in 72. Well, if there was a real bomb threat, they would be evacuating the building, and they were not doing that. So when they called in the bomb threat in 77, we did the same thing because they wanted us to leave the building, and we knew if we got out of the building, we'd never get back in the building again. So we said that, we would move from where we were, and they could bring the dogs in and do whatever, to sniff it out, but we weren't leaving. And that was a vote, and the group decided to stay. And so there were lots and lots of things that were happening in addition to all the substantive discussions that were going on. And the reasons for the rallies outside was to keep the people inside, knowing that people on the outside cared about what was happening. People outside felt that what they were doing was important because they were keeping the people inside. And it was a very serious set of 28 days.
I can only imagine. I wish I could go back in time and be a part of that, just be a fly on the wall or be a participant. I would love to think that I would have been there with you. But I know that our time's getting a little bit short here. I want to get in as many questions as we can, but I did want to ask you real quick. You mentioned in your book there was a divide between the East Coast and the West Coast as far as how aggressive your protest should be. And I think in some regard, that divide still exists a little bit in our community today. What do you think is more effective? Do you think more aggressive forms of protest is effective, or do you think more, you refer to as civil protest in the book? Do you think that's more effective in today's efforts for disability rights?
For today, I think what's important is you need to measure what the issues are and how you respond. I think the work that ADAPT has been doing around healthcare has been great. Mm-hmm. I think organizations concerned with healthcare that were not run by disabled people were looking at what ADAPT was doing, which is, sitting in members' offices that were, looking to do away with the ACA and the
Right.
adverse impact it would have on today's population. So I think the demonstrations that they've done have been totally appropriate. You know, they come in, they get out of their wheelchairs, they demonstrate, they're not harming anybody. And I'm not one that supports harming property or people, but I think making people be disrupted in their lives is completely appropriate when the likelihood in the case of what was going on in the offices in DC and in members' offices around the country is that everybody in those offices has health care. And so, you know, when you're talking about fighting for health care where people don't have or are at risk of losing or not being able to get health care, and demonstrating to get people who have health care coverage to protect our rights, I completely support that.
But I have to ask about the drunk history episode. So Ali Stroker, who uses a wheelchair herself, she portrayed you on that on I believe it's season 5, episode 5. Very entertaining. Told the story of the 504 sit-ins. I've watched that video at least 30 times, I think. So were you in the movement portrayed accurately, or did Comedy Central take liberties with your story?
I was portrayed relatively accurately. It's very funny because Ali and I are now friends.
All right,
so
great.
The night that it showed, it had some inaccuracies in it. For example, the hearings were not held in Washington, D.C. They were held, when you see Crip Camp, they were held in the building in San Francisco.
Right.
Senator Cranston was not one of the people at the hearings. It was Congressman Burton and Congressman Miller. So that was not accurate. And then, oh my God, what's the famous music group that they said?
Jefferson Airplane, I believe.
Yeah, Jefferson Airplane was not there.
Okay. All right. That's good.
I was in Washington when supposedly they were in the building, and I called a friend who had been in the building, and I said, I think I would have known if the Jefferson Airplane were there. Were they? And she said no. But Candace Cable, who some of you may know, she's spinal cord injured and she lives in LA. She was the one that was able to get Drunk History to do this show. So it took her 2 years to get them to do it. And I guess for me, the message to the viewers for programs like Drunk History and Crip Camp is we need to be more demanding of programs that they are authentically telling stories of disabled people.
Right.
Drunk History did a great job on this one piece, but it's been on for years and it's had only one story on disability. And there's so many good stories that could be told. And I think, you know, our voices need to be registered, you know, with these programs. They need to be hiring disabled people as actors. That's another great thing. That's a great thing about what happened, you know, with this program is they had disabled actors. You could see they were all authentic actors, and it was great.